Chad bans the burqa following a suicide attack by a man dressed in the head-to-toe garment. How is Africa navigating international economic turmoil? And a Ramadan initiative in Qatar encourages road safety. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening, I'm Linor Moudou. This is Africa 54. Vincent Makori is off today. Violent attacks by extremist groups have rocked parts of Africa in the past few days. First, let's go to East Africa, where the United States is strongly condemning Al-Shabaab attacks on 2 hotels and an African Union force position in the Somali capital, Mogadishu. At least 16 people were killed in the attacks on the Welihlihe and Sihad hotels on Friday. Mortar rounds were also fired Friday at Mogadishu's former football stadium, which now serves as a key African Union base. No casualties were reported in that attack. A statement issued by the U.S. State Department says, quote, Al-Shabaab once again has demonstrated its brutality and its complete rejection of a Somali society free of violence and oppression. Now to Chad, where a police spokesman says a man dressed in a woman's burqa blew himself up in the main market in the capital, N'Djamena, early on Saturday, killing at least 15 people and wounding another 74. Although no group has claimed a responsibility for the attack, Chadian officials are blaming Boko Haram, the Islamist militant group based in neighboring Nigeria, for a series of bombings and shootings in the Central African country in recent weeks. According to Reuters, a witness saw at least 10 bodies lying near the entrance to the market, where Red Cross workers rushed to aid the wounded. A police spokesman detailed what happened.
Very early this morning, around 9 o'clock, a terrorist dressed in a burqa, also known as an abaya, tried to enter the N'Djamena Central Market. Suspected of being up to something, he was stopped by the defense and police forces at the market's southern entry, who asked him to unveil. After trying to enter by force, the terrorist was overpowered and immediately blew off the charge he was carrying under his burqa.
And Chad has been at the forefront of a regional military campaign against Boko Haram, which is seeking to carve out an Islamist state in northeast Nigeria and has mounted raids in neighboring Chad, Cameroon, and Niger. Joining us in the studio for more on the violence in Chad is VOA reporter Timothée Donangmai. Timothée, welcome to Africa 54.
Hello, Lina.
So there have been reports that actually Boko Haram has claimed this latest attack. What can you tell us in terms of the latest on this particular attack?
This particular attack happened in the main market in N'Djamena. For those who know the Chadian capital, it's a very crowded area, but fortunately it happened early in the morning, so there were only about 15 people killed and more than 70 injured in that attack. Okay,
do you think there are more reports in terms of the number of injured people? Is this more coming?
The total toll from last month and this month is about 60 people killed now in 3 attacks.
And as I mentioned earlier, we've seen an increasing number of violence in the country, especially since June. What can you tell us in terms of how Boko Haram is reacting to Chad's involvement in fighting the terrorist group?
First of all, I would like to point out that this is a total shock for Chadians. They have never experienced such terrorist attacks before, so it's a real shock for them. Now, Boko Haram, as you know, is operating in Nigeria, but Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon are very close countries. They share borders, and Nigeria and Chad share a long border in the Lake Chad area, which is a very porous border. People can cross in canoes and whatnot. So it's been easy for those militants to probably cross into Chad and organize there. And also, Chadian President Idriss Déby Itno said last month that some Chadians from the Lake Chad area have been recruited by Boko Haram and trained in Nigeria, and they are the ones who came back and are conducting those terrorist attacks.
But when we look at the geography in this region, how Cameroon, Nigeria, and Chad are very close, and looking at the history of the attacks in this region, do you think that there could have been some warnings in terms of the fact that Boko Haram could eventually come to Chad, but these warnings were not taken perhaps seriously?
I think so, yeah. There were warnings, like you have to understand that Cameroon's territory that is wedged between Chad and Nigeria is a narrow strip of land. It's not too wide.
Okay.
So it can easily be crossed by anyone from Nigeria to Chad.
And quickly, and then, what is the government doing before I'll let you go?
The government has, as you know, banned the burqa. They also posted security personnel around mosques, churches, and they asked churches to provide people who will help the police to identify potential threats to the churches and mosques.
Timothy, thank you so much for joining us
You're
today.
welcome.
And that was VOA's Timothy Donangmai reporting on Chad. Now, just a short time ago, Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari appointed all new defense chiefs and filled the post of National Security Advisor, according to a presidential spokesman. The names have not yet been released. Early on Monday, Mr. Buhari sacked the heads of the Army, Navy, and Air Force as he formulates a new strategy for fighting Boko Haram. The former general has made crushing the terrorist group his top priority, and the dismissals were widely anticipated. Since his inauguration in May, President Buhari has moved Nigeria's Defense Command Center to Maiduguri, the birthplace of the jihadi sect, and is setting up the headquarters for a multinational joint task force in Chad's capital in N'Djamena. Meanwhile, a Cameroonian military officer says Boko Haram militants are suspected of 2 suicide attacks in the northern Cameroon town of Fotokol late on Sunday. At least a dozen civilians and a Chadian soldier were killed. The first explosion went off inside a bar near a Cameroon Special Forces camp just after sundown, as many were breaking the Ramadan fast, according to the officer. He says the second explosion followed as soldiers approached the bar. L'Œil du Sahel, a newspaper in northern Cameroon, reported that the 2 attackers were war burkas. Now, Boko Haram militants are also being blamed for an attack on a prison in the southern Niger town of Difa late Saturday. Niger military sources say the assault was an apparent attempt to free fellow members of the terrorist group. Military sources also say 3 of the assailants and 1 soldier were killed before the attack was repelled. A group identifying itself as the Islamic State of Egypt claims it is responsible for a deadly car bombing in Cairo. The explosion in front of the Italian consulate in Egypt's capital killed 1 person and destroyed a large section of the historic building Saturday. Egyptian authorities say investigators are reviewing closed-circuit video recordings from the area, but so far no suspects have been publicly linked to the attack. Now to the latest on Ebola in West Africa. The United Nations say the international community is pledging more financial help than 3 West African states thought as they recover from the Ebola epidemic that killed more than 11,000 people. The UN says the more than $5 billion the presidents of Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone were promised at the International Ebola Recovery Conference in New York is nearly double their initial request. Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf told the UN conference Friday that funds are already helping people of the 3 countries to rebuild their lives.
The size, timeliness, and innovative nature of your support to our nations and our sub-region have been truly unprecedented and made the difference in the effectiveness of our response.
And President Johnson says the recent isolated cases of Ebola in Liberia this month is a reminder that overcoming the epidemic does not mean the battle with the disease is over. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said the strategy to end the outbreak is working, but the final stretch of the response remains particularly challenging. Now turning to the Greek debt crisis, Greece and its European partners have reached a 3rd bailout deal after a marathon summit session. We get more from Africa 54's Esther Gitui-Ewart.
Greece agreed to a range of tough reforms in order to receive the $100 billion loan it needs. European Union President Donald Tusk said Monday from Brussels that a unanimous agreement had been reached after 17 hours of talks.
There are strict conditions to be met. The approval of several national parliaments, including the Greek parliament, is now needed for negotiations on an ESM program to formally begin. Nevertheless, the decision gives Greece a chance to get back on track with the support of European partners. It also avoids the social, economic and political consequences that a negative outcome would have brought.
Earlier, the French news agency quoted an anonymous source as saying a compromise agreement had been hashed out by Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras with German Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President François Hollande, and Mr. Tusk. Mr. Tsipras told reporters the deal was the best they could hope for.
The deal is difficult, but we have prevented the pursuit of a transfer of public property abroad. We have prevented the plan of financial asphyxiation and the collapse of the financial system, a plan that was designed up to its last detail perfectly, recently, and had started to be implemented. Finally, we achieved in this hard fight the restructure of the debt and secured financing for the medium term.
Prime Minister Tsipras must now convince the Greek parliament to approve the agreement by Wednesday, including reforms to tax and pension plans that will cut deep into Greek society. Once parliament approves the pact, Mr. Tsipras must convince his 18 European partners to release bridging funds in the interim to avert a state bankruptcy. Once parliament approves the pact, Mr. Tsipras must convince his 18 European partners to release bridging funds in the interim to avert a state bankruptcy. Esther Githu-Ewart, VOA News, Washington.
Pope Francis has returned to the Vatican after wrapping a week-long tour of Latin America by visiting one of the poorest neighborhoods in Paraguay's capital, Asunción. The pontiff's second trip to Latin America since his election to the papacy in 2013 also included stops in Ecuador and Bolivia, countries mired in poverty and crime. Voice of America's Latika Hoke has our report.
The poor in Paraguay's capital, Asunción, are excited about the Pope's visit. The leader of the Catholic Church will visit a slum and enter one of its poorest dwellings.
Who could have thought that the Pope would come to my house? Even if he didn't enter, but just pass by, that would already be great.
Visit to the slum is scheduled for Sunday, the last day of the pontiff's 8-day tour of 3 countries. He arrived in Paraguay on Friday from Bolivia, where he addressed inmates in a notorious prison. 2 years ago, 36 people were killed in the Palmasola facility during a clash between rival gangs.
We cannot forget the reasons which led to the massacre. We must overcome our abandonment. I ask you, Pope Francis, to intervene so that the government listens to our demands. Dignified nutrition, programs for real social rehabilitation so that we do not reoffend, and we ask for real justice, Holy Father.
Pope Francis has ventured into places where few popes went before him, seeking support for the most needy and neglected populations. On arrival to Ecuador a week ago, he reiterated that message.
We can find in the gospel the keys that will allow us to face the current challenges, valuing differences, promoting dialogue and participation without excluding anyone, so that all the progress and achievements that are being made can be consolidated to guarantee a better future for all.
The pontiff returns to the Vatican late Sunday, a day after the opening of a groundbreaking trial. A former papal ambassador to the Dominican Republic will answer charges that he paid for sex with minors and possessed child pornography. It will be the first ever trial on such charges in the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church. Zlatica Hoke, VOA News, Washington.
We want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the conversation on Facebook. The address is Africa 54, and check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Coming up, a closer look at how some extremists begin online and anonymously. Stay with us. I want
wanted to present music and a side of American culture that is most important to me, that is a part of who I am. They're going to get some incredible performances. That's one of the things I love, bringing these artists in so you can get to see them do what they do. It's soul music, and that's what music is. It's that which comes from the soul.
As the world watches the Greek financial crisis unfold and China's stocks falling and climbing again, many in Africa are curious to know what all this means to their continent. To get some clarity, Africa 54 host Vincent Makori sat down with Bertrand Badre, Managing Director and World Bank Group Chief Financial Officer.
So that's something where you have all these pieces moving around, and that's where institutions like the World Bank are extremely important, because we can help countries connect the dots and see how you can better react, what type of political framework should you adapt, what type of assistance can we provide, etc. And what is interesting, in the midst of all these kind of moving parts, we have this big conference in Addis Ababa starting next week. So on the one hand, you have a world which looks more and more fragmented. On the other hand, you have people who say, okay, despite all this fragmentation, we have to come together to find the appropriate way to move forward together.
Actually, now that you've made reference to the conference in Addis Ababa, this is about raising funds for sustainable development, particularly in Africa. And some people are saying perhaps the best way for African countries would be to kind of look domestically, perhaps try to be less dependent on external financing. Is this something viable?
I think there is not the best way. There are a combination of very good ways. And that's what we've tried to put together with IMF and the other development bank, including the African Development Bank. For the first time in history, we published a short note together, but we call it billions to trillions. And what do we mean with that? It's exactly your questions. Billions, this is the order of magnitude of ODA, public money coming from the advanced economy to the emerging and developing economies. 135 billion last year. It's a lot. And it's not a lot. It's 0 point something % of global GDP, of the money created by the world every year. So it's very little. But it's still absolutely necessary. In many cases, there is no substitute for this public money. So you need to have the combination of the billions and the trillions of domestic money and the trillions of good combination of public and private efforts. So that's really what we mean by bringing the billions to the trillions.
In terms of fiscal discipline, we know that in the past, the World Bank, the IMF, they used to kind of not just persuade, but literally attach these conditionalities to African economies and other developing economies. Is there any stronger push right now to kind of require countries to kind of pursue a particular way of fiscal discipline in order for them not to fall into the situation where they're unable to not only achieve their objectives, but sometimes be unable to pay even whatever they owe to external creditors?
So there are two aspects to that question. The first aspect, of course, bearing in mind what we've been through over the last 40, 50 years and the debt crisis in many countries, and the fact that basically we have forgiven some of the debt, of the past few years. It does cost a lot of money to every party. So we don't want to kind of restart this game of over-indebtedness. That's absolutely clear, and this is something which is valid all over the world. Our model is really country-based. So how do we engage with a given country? We start with what we call a single country diagnostic. So the World Bank Group, public and private arm together, tell the country, okay, this is what we think your biggest challenges are. This is what we think you should be willing to do. And then based on this diagnostic, we have to sign a country partnership framework which say, okay, over the next 3 years, we understand that these are your priorities. Among your priorities, this is where we can help.
You have this conference in Addis Ababa, going to produce some recommendations to be submitted to the UN by September. How challenging is it when you have to deal with the different individual countries with different economic policies and levels of development?
So we have to manage expectations. And you also have to consider that still today, many people consider Africa as one country. Whereas, as you rightly say, this is 54 countries. And the problem in one country do not necessarily reflect in another country, etc. So you have to help people navigate the complexity of the continent, its opportunity, its potential, but also some difficulties. And we have to make Africa a viable, attractive opportunity for investors. We have to help African countries mobilize domestic resources. So that's a combination of domestic, strong domestic underlying foundation with capacity to attract outside money. That will make a difference.
Since the mass shooting in Charleston, South Carolina, there has been much discussion about extremism on the internet and what leads someone from writing to violence. VOA's Caroline Presutti introduces us to two Americans, similar in age but far apart on views.
This is the face of American extremism in the 20th century. In the 21st century, it's this. Open extremism lurks under the surface, on social media, in chat rooms where users can rail against blacks, Asians, Hispanics, the government, Jews, and more. A computer screen gives anonymity. We found even to interview someone, we had to go into the shadows to hide his identity.
Through the internet.
Roger is 26 and affiliated with a website identified as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Roger doesn't approve of a mixed society.
I think that cultures become expressed fully only when there are boundaries between them. And that when you mix them together, it ends up going down to a kind of the lowest common denominator between them.
He cites what he calls the contact theory to keep whites and blacks apart.
And the idea is that if you bring people together, that it reduces prejudice and things like that. And that's actually often the case for all groups except blacks. When people of other races have close interactions with blacks, they often come away more prejudiced than they did before. It's not true when whites interact with Asians and things like that.
I really can't relate, to be quite honest.
22-year-old Alyssa Morris grew up in an urban, multicultural area. She's also computer savvy, but doesn't spend her life online.
If they stopped sitting behind their screen and talking and got out there and really were open to seeing the world, maybe they would have different views.
Analysts say the internet has made it easier to find people of similar views. J.M. Berger has written extensively on extremists and their use of social media. He spoke on Skype.
There's very few things as powerful as having someone tell you they agree with what you believe or your world or your view of the world.
Dylan Ruth got that validation through his web postings and a manifesto on race. In June, police say he entered a black church in South Carolina and killed 9 people. The dilemma for law enforcement is knowing when extreme chat will turn to violence. Clint Van Zandt is a former FBI profiler.
I've seen members of supremacist groups, for example, say, we can't just tell one nut who's ranting and raging on the internet from the nut who will pick up the gun the next day and go and kill someone.
So Van Zandt says, if they can't do it, how can law enforcement? It's a question that will haunt profilers as they try to get inside the heads of suspects who conceal themselves with the web. Caroline Presutti, VOA News, Washington.
It's time now for a short break. Still to come on Africa 54. A roadside initiative encourages a safe driving during Ramadan. We'll be right back.
إنهم من الوزن الثقيل من ضمنهم شخص
qui scellés à partir du fusil de l'État sont à venir. La phase à venir est la phase. Ce sont donc toutes les structures, certains villages que vous connaissez, vous pouvez en nommer plusieurs.
Wherever you are, Voice of America is on air, reaching more than 130 million weekly, worldwide. in more than 40 languages. Online, social media, and breaking news from around the world. On the go, dozens of new features on popular platforms with new apps and trending topics. Voice of America. On air, online, on the go.
Welcome back to Africa 54. Here's what's trending. A group of volunteers in Qatar are trying to raise awareness about the dangers of speeding home to break the Ramadan fast by handing out free iftar meals on the road. Many observant Muslims who have been fasting since dawn are in a rush to get home before prayers at sunset when they can break their fast. The group of volunteers hand out free meals to drivers in the streets so they can eat without speeding home. The food packs also contain a message imploring people to drive safely. Next up, a journalist is robbed live on air. Journalist Pedro Ferrith was doing a live broadcast from his vehicle using Periscope, a live streaming app for smartphones, when the robbery took place. The video shows the journalist speaking to the camera when a man approaches the vehicle from the driver's side and demands money and the mobile phone. Ferrith can be heard saying, "We are being robbed," in Spanish, and then tells the robber, "I'm live on air," as he demands to be given the phone. The video has gone viral since it was published on Wednesday. And in other viral video news, all was going smoothly at a preseason friendly football match in Austria. That was, however, until things turned a little foul. There was an unwelcome pitch invasion as 7 ducks waddled their way into the action, but the referee didn't get into a flap. With a few blasts of his whistle, his expertise guided the ducks off the pitch, but as it turns out, there was little point. The match was abandoned before the end due to a waterlogged pitch, and that's what's trending today. And it's time for our sports report, as Sunny Young is off today. But it was a thrilling weekend at Wimbledon. This year's Wimbledon tennis champions are Novak Djokovic and Serena Williams. Novak Djokovic claimed his 3rd Wimbledon title on Sunday with a dominating win over Swiss Roger Federer, who was after his 8th Wimbledon title. And on Saturday, American Serena Williams won her 6th Wimbledon title, beating Spain's Garbiñe Muguruza in 2 sets, 6-4, 6-4. It is Serena's 4th successive Grand Slam crown. She now holds all 4 major tennis titles at the same time, having also won the U.S., Australian, and French Opens. Her triumphs are being called the Serena Slam. How is that for an achievement? Now that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. For more news, tune in to VOA's evening radio show, Africa News Tonight at 1800 UTC, and in the mornings to Daybreak Africa between 300 and 600 UTC, Monday through Friday. Thanks for watching, and good night from Washington.
Welcome to the Voice of America's News Words, where we teach you about words in the news.
Listen for the word that means not working. Here is U.S. House of Representatives Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi.
We thank our federal workers for what they have done. I'm sad about the fact that they had to be furloughed and have this uncertainty in their lives, on top of every other uncertainty in our economy.
A furlough is a temporary leave from work. More than 800,000 U.S. federal workers were furloughed in 2013.
Congress could not agree on a budget, so workers were told to stay home. Much of the government was closed. Now, when you hear the word furlough, you will know what this news word means.